Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of April 5th, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, here to talk with Josh Blank again, of the Research Director of the same Texas Politics Project. How are we today, Josh?
Doing excellent.
I thought so. We got a lot done this morning.
I'm excited to be here.
That's good. And talking about an exciting topic. So right before the, de facto long holiday weekend around Easter, we released the results of a poll that we did in March that Josh and I developed in conjunction with a team of researchers at UT's Energy Institute. And we asked dozens of questions about Texans' experience during the winter storm, about their attitudes towards the causes and the consequences of the storm, their views of and expectations about the possible policy responses, particularly those being engaged as we speak in the Texas legislature. And their views about a wide range of actors, from their neighbors, utility providers, industry, state political leaders, regulatory bodies, corporate actors. We threw a lot in this poll, some of which was developed, specifically towards research objectives of some of our colleagues at the UT Energy Institute, some of which was stuff that we were interested in. It was a nice collaboration with among a large, diverse group of people, and I thought we got interesting results, didn't you? I mean, yeah. Sometimes we forget to even stop and talk about that. I think we crank these things out and you move on to the next thing. But I was pretty happy with this.
Well, I think when you conduct a lot of polls, you kind of get used to uninteresting results from time to time, and you start to find ways that they're interesting, maybe to you, if not other people. And I'm thinking of some of our listeners going, "Yeah, no kidding." Yeah, well, exactly. Well, and look, we know it's not like every question we ask is some home run, and the truth is, that's good because obviously we don't expect everything we ask to have some sort of shocking and ridiculous result. But in this case, it was actually very interesting because what I always sort of the way I classify interesting is usually, how much do I think I know about what the responses are likely to look like? And if it's a question or a topic we've asked a ton of stuff about, usually we have a pretty good idea of what, the distribution of opinions can look like. With something like this, really, you have no idea, right? It's this huge event that just happened. We don't even really fully understand the scope of it in terms of, people's experiences of it. Again, there's been a lot of political talk about it. But what was so nice about this is I think this poll was a really, great mix of, both sort of just the kind of practical policy analysis stuff. What happened to people? What was their experience like? If we were trying to develop solutions for the future, what kind of things would you want to deal with? And I think this poll actually uncovers some things that maybe people aren't talking about. Yeah. But on the other hand, there's sort of this general, set of evaluations of, the range of actors involved, what people perceive as actually having happened, because I think a big part of this we're going to discuss a little bit is sort of the attempts to frame what happened and how that's landed with people. And then also, what their reactions are, to the policies that are being discussed as a result to, as a response to what is, ultimately actually a very complicated, event in a very complicated system of interlocking parts. And so, I think this poll gets us a lot of the way towards understanding a lot of things that I can't say, prior to doing it that we knew the answers to.
I think you make a good point about complexity. And this has been, if not the calendar year, because this happened in 2021, but certainly the last 18 months or so have seen us engage in a series of, we've talked about this on the podcast before, a series of problems that are very systemic in nature, or at least function in very complex systems. you know, and are directly related to them. Obviously, thinking about the pandemic and the pandemic response, and now this. And so it's been very interesting for these kinds of things that, you know, we didn't do in the first, 10 years of polling, and that certainly, now have come up and really shifted things. So, let's start with some of the framing. And as we talk about this, we'll go back and, we could do this in kind of a linear way, but I think for our purposes, I think we'll start with the framing and then go backwards. Back into some of the causes.
We could have a linear discussion about this, but that wouldn't be this podcast.
Right. Then we'd be different people in a different podcast.
Yeah. So let's do it. Let's do it this way.
So you talked about framing, and I think, one of the things that really came out of this, I think, was where the leadership in the state were successful and maybe less successful. Although I think, we see signs of a lot of success here in framing the crisis, and particularly who was going to get blamed. And I think we talked about this a little bit a couple weeks ago before we had these results, but pretty clearly early on, you have to say it. I mean, the governor was pretty clearly looking to hang this on ERCOT. I think from, if not the very first press conference and public address as the storm is unfolding, in which there were members of the Railroad Commission and the PUC and ERCOT and, other emergency actors in this kind of all hands on deck, here comes the storm press conference. Once things started going bad, we started seeing fewer of those people show up at those events. In particular, the ERCOT people seemed to be no longer invited. Yeah. And that was a sign. And then we saw obviously very explicit signs saying that this was ERCOT and this was ERCOT's fault, and that was going to have to be where the attention was put. And I think, for an entity that almost certainly nobody knew anything about, or very few members of the public probably even knew existed, which makes sense given their role as an intermediary in the system.
Right.
A lot of people had attitudes about ERCOT, and they were overwhelmingly negative.
Right. But I mean, what he says, they had a lot of attitudes, not deep attitudes. Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's two items that kind of touch on these regulatory bodies. We asked people just at the outset of the poll, before we even got really going in this set of topics, how familiar would you say you are with ERCOT, right, the PUC? We defined, we call it a Public Utility Commission, but, the PUC and the Railroad Commission. And overall, and this is, again, after a month of many actors, explicitly bashing these entities. They've been, in the paper, in the news. And even at this point, only 16% of Texans said they were extremely familiar with ERCOT. 7% said the same of the PUC. 5% said the same of the Railroad Commission. Having said that, 72% said they disapproved strongly of how ERCOT handled the storm.
Well, they did 72% disapproved, and I think 61 strongly, but
72%
distinction
disapproved.
Without much of a difference.
Right, 72% disapproved of how ERCOT handled the storm, 50% disapproved of how the PUC handled the storm, and 25% disapproved of how the Railroad Commission handled the storm. And that's not to say that people were overwhelmingly positive on the Railroad Commission. Only 12% approved of how the Railroad Commission handled the storm. The rest just had no opinion or idea, which I would say, if you're the Railroad Commission, victory.
Right, which we'll get to, and I think that, yeah. So I mean, from just thinking about that and doing some math, and so basically, when we asked people, how big a factor, these entities were, or whether they approved of these entities, and how a variety of actors handled the crisis, 80% had an opinion about ERCOT, 62% had an opinion about the Public Utility Commission, only 37% had an opinion about the Railroad Commission. So that right there, sets up a lot of the politics of this, and suggests that while, I think the governor early on and, was trying to blame ERCOT, and there wasn't much discussion of the Public Utility Commission. Mm-hmm. And when the utility commissioners, or when the chair of the Utility Commission went to testify in that very long and eventful day in the legislature, I mean, look, the legislators certainly, beat up on ERCOT and ERCOT CEO Bill Magnus, but they put a lot of heat on the PUC. And I think the chairman of the Utility Commission at that point, who's now departed, made a pretty good effort to avoid responsibility, and that was pretty unsuccessful. And it was unsuccessful, not only with Democrats, which one might be expect, since the Public Utility Commission is made up of gubernatorial appointees, but there were a lot of Republicans really not buying it either. And some of that was the division among, to broach another topic, the lieutenant governor and his allies, and the governor and his allies. But this became kind of a legislative executive branch thing as far as the Public Utility Commission was concerned. Mm-hmm. And I think that shows up in these numbers. And so I think that's where, we can say, in some ways, the effort to blame ERCOT obviously yielded some fruit for Republicans here, given these numbers. But the effort at damage control by the governor and sort of sheltering the PUC, given not only these numbers, but the fact that all three of them wound up having to resign under pressure to one degree or another, that didn't work very well.
Yeah, and I think the reason that it clearly, when I'm hearing you talk about this, part of the reaction I have is, ultimately, let's say, mistakes were made. Right. Let's say, and the question is who is doing those mistakes? Ultimately, one of the big difficulties in this space is the fact that I think, and you've seen this, you've seen various actors, who have every reason to defend the system we have of electricity generation, both saying that the market system failed and that it worked. And so ultimately part of, I think, what's going on is about the, it's about the operation of the system. And I think, you'll see this, and we have this in some other polling items that I think touches on this, and so there's this question of, well, who do we blame? And there's I think the psychology of blame is interested in all of this too.
Right.
But the bigger issue is, if we're not going to say that the system is a problem, and I think that's something that Republicans in particular are loath to say, given that our electric system is, a standout as a market-based energy, producing system. And it's supposed to be an exemplar. So it's not very easy for Republicans to say, boy, that's, that market-based system really messed up. So ultimately then it comes down to operation of the system. And, the question is the system, the child of legislators and policymakers, or is it these guys who are running the system that they've set up? And I think that's kind of where, all this focus, there's an incentive for everyone, I think, in the political process, whether you're the governor, or the lieutenant governor or the legislature, to try to shift the emphasis as much as you can to the way that these actors are running the system, not the system itself. And the thing is, there's some evidence in the polling for why that's why that might work, but also why it might not. So we asked in another part of the poll, basically what caused this? We gave them a list, you give them a big list of things. Some of them are more reasonable and realistic, some of them less so, but they reflect the public discussion, which is the point here. Yeah. And, the clear leading cause, according to Texans, is the lack of winterization, both at electric facilities, but also at gas facilities, followed by the unprecedented nature of the storm. Now, it seems to me what strikes me in this discussions we're having is like, well, okay, well, then whose fault is that?
Right.
And the thing is,
look, it's fair to, step outside of the framing for a second and point out that people that either worked in this, I've had, people that have worked in or close to this system and people that were involved in its architecture say, look, ERCOT is designed and really set up to be the guys that take the blame if something goes wrong. Right. And, and look, there's something, if you're going to be the person, driving the car, the roads, if you're driving a car and you rear end somebody, the roads might be wet. You might have been distracted by, something that, was worth being distracted by, like a child in distress. But you're driving the car, you hit the car in front of you, it's your fault. And, and that's kind of structural to the way we drive cars. And I think there's something to, to be entirely fair, it's okay. No, I don't want to be taken as saying, look, ERCOT just got unfairly blamed. They, nothing went wrong. They couldn't have done anything differently.
Sure.
But the extent to which public opinion landed this way is pretty interesting.
Well, and I'll take this as my opportunity to talk.
Given the complexity of all the things that you were, where you were going with the factors.
Well, and I'll take this as my opportunity to try to quickly, talk about this for 1 second, which is, I think this is really, an interesting aspect of the framing around this, which is that, generally speaking, it's a lot easier for people to conceptualize individual blame than systemic problems.
Right.
Ultimately, just as people, we're limited in our ability to to attend to anything, to focus on anything. And we can basically focus on three things. We can focus on ourselves and our internal dialogue and all that kind of stuff, which is what we like to do generally. We can focus on things in our environment, other people, right? Other stimuli that we can see or interact with. And then there's this third area, which is this idea of sort of focusing and attending to systems. And ultimately, this is very hard to do. Ultimately, because we're just limited animals. You've heard of chunking. We can only basically store 7 things in our working memory at once. That's why phone numbers are about 7 numbers long. You can extend that with all kinds of tools and tricks and whatever. But then when you're talking about something like, well, we've got this market-based system with ERCOT and the PUC, and we've got providers, and we've got the people transmitting the energy, and then we've got the retail.
And it's marketized, but it's a regulated market designed by.
I haven't been counting, but we're past 7, and all of these things require definitional explanations. So it's just one of those things. Trying to when voters want answers, even if the most honest answer, and even if it's the answer that politicians want to give is, look, there were problems with the system that we're going to address, and these were the problems. It's a fair bet that people aren't going to understand either the problems with the system or the solutions that are going to be there. But what's a lot easier to say is, you know what, these guys screwed up.
Yeah. And then once you go, then once you go on that hunt, all these other factors come into play, and you're not really trying to understand anything anymore.
No, it's funny.
Right.
I like
laying blame and understanding ideally overlap a lot, but
a lot of anecdotal stories around people who don't follow politics as closely as we do, and who aren't involved in the process. Those are the conversations I'm often most interested in, just to hear what people kind of think. And most of the initial, reactions I had after this were, why can't we sue ERCOT?
Yeah.
And it's like, where do I start?
Right.
And the answer is, and then what I did, and then I,
can I just get you another beer?
Well, that's what I say. And then I think better, and I think, no, I don't know.
Right.
Sovereign immunity.
And one of these other, and so, in terms of, then how that hunt gets affected by conditions on the ground, I've been, fascinated by the role of the Railroad Commission on this, and the fact that, as if you've made it this far in the podcast, you're among,
you care,
you're among the, as we'll say, the about 39% of Texans who know what the Railroad Commission does. Right. And which is, regulate the oil and gas industry.
And, we didn't even put this. I haven't mentioned the item yet that you're referring to. So in the back of the survey, we always ask people what we call information questions. And we preface it by saying, hey, look, these are questions. You may know the answer. You may not. A lot of people don't. If you don't know the answer, just tell us. And part of the idea here is allow people to say they don't know something, but also then we use these items to sort of assess, a basic measure of whether people are informed or not. We don't use it that much, but it's kind of a common political science thing to do. We played with this at the end, and we basically asked, which state agency regulates oil and gas production in the state of Texas. 39% correctly identified the Texas Railroad Commission. 38% said the PUC.
Right, and only 17% admitted that they didn't really know.
Right.
Right. So, and there are, and I think we talked about this briefly a couple weeks ago. There are, often efforts to, or at least not efforts is maybe the wrong word. The idea is raised of, hey, why don't we just call the Railroad Commission, the Oil and Gas Commission or something like this? Mm-hmm. And people are like, no. We're not going to do that. And if you look at, these blame items, and you look at the fact that going back to this, systemic piece, and without making any judgments about blame, you can't really discuss the system without talking about the role that, natural gas supplies play in the system that broke down, kind of full stop. So, the fact that the Railroad Commission has, and to some extent the oil and gas industry have escaped, I think, a lot of discussion and attention relative to the others, and they haven't escaped completely. There have been some uncomfortable discussions, but for the most part, this has been focused, on restructuring ERCOT, restructuring, perhaps, restructuring the PUC. Not a lot out there that's moving anywhere in the legislative process about, addressing, issues related to oil and gas, and particularly to the railroad commissions.
Well,
and there's now been a couple of pieces on that recently. Andrea Zielinski had a piece in Texas Monthly. There was a piece on the Texas Tribune today. I think it was today or yesterday. And I can't remember who wrote it. Forgive me. If you have it up in a window, Josh, we can give credit where credit is due.
I liked credit.
Now, all of this, as we've alluded to, points to the question of, well, what's the response going to be? And look, there's been, a lot, obviously there's been a lot of response in the legislature. The fact that this affected such a broad swath of Texans, did get the attention and cause concerns among legislators, as we alluded to earlier. There were, hearings very quickly within about a week or so. I mean, as soon as things were stabilized, there were hearings, and those hearings were multiple. There have been a couple of rounds of them in different committees.
Yeah, I mean, we heard from various people we know that they were definitely hearing from constituents. But just to give you, some of the size and shape, at least of the measurements we have now, these are voters. So I would actually say these numbers are actually probably a little bit lower than what I would expect for the state as a whole, because voters as a whole are going to be of higher socioeconomic status than the state as a whole by comparison points.
Right.
So we'd expect negative impacts to, it's in the data, but you see negative impacts will reverberate amongst the people least able to bear them. But overall, among voters, 66% said that their electricity stopped working. 54% said they had an interruption in their water service. 1 in 5 had damage to their home. 56%, and this is sort of an important one, the ones we're not talking about, 56% didn't have reliable internet service during the storm. 30%, so a third, were unable to go to work and lost income due to the storm. So, when we sort of think about this, and it's like, hey, why are we, if there's anybody out there who's saying, hey, why are we still talking about this? Well, it is a big deal.
Right. And people have expectations that something was going to be done about this, and had ideas about what the legislature should do. And I think one of the things that's very interesting, there's an interesting dynamic here in that, when we look at the approval ratings of political figures in response to this, they're pretty mediocre. I mean, Abbott's, I think, was the governor, the rating of the governor's response was, I think, 3 or 4 points right below his overall response. Is that right?
Yeah. So his response to the storm was 41% approve, 45% disapprove, which was, better than Cruz and Cornyn. And we'll talk about that because that's funny in a second.
Yes.
But lower than, honestly, all the entities and actors that were closer to the ground. Neighbors were ranked the highest in terms of their response, local businesses next, then local government, then your own water utility and your own electric utility, then the governor.
Right. So that's not, and then when we ask people, do you expect the legislature to respond, to pass an effective responses to the storm and its effects?
Yeah. Only 9% were extremely confident. 60% were either somewhat or not very confident.
Right. So not very confident. In general, a lack of confidence. Now, I think but what's interesting about that, though, is if you look at the kind of solutions that Texans think ought to be coming down the pike, they're
reasonable.
They're reasonable, and they do. And look, there's some it's endogenous here because we frame the responses, a lot of the responses to at least some of them to what is on offer at the legislature. Yeah. But nonetheless, I mean, winterization seems to have been the thing. The winterization of facilities and providing for that in some way seems to be emerging pretty front and center in the legislature, and that's front and center in public opinion, right?
Well, that's what's kind of interesting, I think, about, this discussion we're having about, simplicity and complexity and systemic versus, individual actors, is that, despite all the noise around this and all the posturing and positioning, I would say it seems like the voters landed at a pretty consistent position, which is they said, the biggest cause of this was the lack of winterization, the unprecedented nature of the storm, and then further down, it could be policymaking failures or independence of Texas Electric Grid. And even further down below that is human error. So what do they think that should happen? What of the policy proposals? Number one response, or the issue, or the policy that had the highest support was required energy providers to winterize, followed with a lot less intensity, but still number 2, which is basically just paying for them to winterize.
Yeah.
Now, the difference there is that, in requiring has a lot of strong support, whereas paying for them is split between strong and somewhat. So it's not as much strong support. After that, the next two highest, policies were required ERCOT members to reside in Texas, which I think is, an interesting sort of weird discussion point out of all of this.
Yeah.
And then the other one is the higher energy reserve requirements, basically having the regulators require higher energy reserves. And after that, there's a pretty big drop. But, there's not a huge amount of support for like a bunch of stuff that has nothing to do, or let's say has limited potential effect. If you look at what people saw happen during the storm, how they understand it, what they want to see on the back end is actually, I'm actually proud of Texans on this one. This is like a pretty good alignment of, of the whole thing.
It will be interesting to see if the legislature gets credit, if they do all this stuff, or they do the winterizing, or they, if we go and tell people they did this, will they approve, will the approval of the legislature's performance go up? I don't think so.
I don't think so. This is such a flaming bag of poop, because think about it, right? So you do this, and then first things first, let's say it's successful. Nothing happens, but assume that, overall energy bills are going to have to go up somewhere to pay for some of the costs of all this. Not even what the legislature is doing. I'm just saying the cost of the storm.
That's just
the way this stuff works.
That was baked in from the moment.
Right.
We saw how severe it all was.
So as much as, as active as the legislature has been, they can't go out and be like, we did all this stuff, because really all that people are going to notice is, well, my bill went up. The flip side is that if we have a brownout come July, none of it matters.
There's going to be hell to pay. Well, and I think it also, it also raises the issue of, how salient this remain, this bundle of issues remains, how salient it remains for how long, and, and how it just, as you say, brownouts or how much it just gets crowded out.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting question about whether there is, any election relevance for this in any direct way. Now, I think there's an overall arc in which this feeds into a larger frame, that Republican elected officials are worried about, because when you have the COVID response, which, for all the attempt to make it seem otherwise, has not been particularly great in Texas, and has been politically problematic, but just from a kind of demonstration of capacity and responsiveness position has not been great. Then you have essentially a short-term infrastructure collapse, and now we are having a discussion about corporations and voting. The Texas is open for business and is a great place for everyone, for businesses and people to relocate and set up shop, because this is such a great environment, which has been central to Republican appeals, at least, in part, and certainly central to the Republican brand. All looks a little dinged up.
Yeah, let me add two things to that list, right? Two other things I'll add is, if the legislature managed to pass the trigger bill that would outlaw abortion if the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, I think there's going to be a very a very troubling for the state business reaction if the legislature goes through with that. It'll have to wait to see what happens, but the idea of Austin becoming, a Southern tech hub, if it isn't already, that's going to be a problem, probably. The other thing I'll add is, but depending, what gets passed around gun rights or loosening gun rights or expanding gun access, I'm not saying this, I don't even know how to preface this, but ultimately there's going to be another mass shooting. And when, and the idea is this is the first legislative session after El Paso, after George Floyd, after a lot of big issues that have really activated, in particular, large shares of Democrats, but also Republicans, not in the same ways, it's going to be interesting to see, again, in terms of this narrative, what happens next summer going into the fall, and how, the orientation of legislative leaders now, is a reflection of priorities. And I think, it's becoming even more contentious than I think it was before in some ways. So, as I said, we asked in the poll about, basically approval of the response of a range of actors towards the winter storm. Another thing we asked was basically who do you think was most hurt? And this was an open-ended question. And what most people said was either, basically the poor or the elderly was the main response that people said, anyone who basically couldn't, handle the storm. But in the approval battery, it makes me think maybe the person who was hurt the most by this is John Cornyn. Because even with Ted Cruz abandoning the state in the middle of the storm to go, of all places, to Mexico.
And getting narked out by his friends.
And getting narked out by his quote-unquote friends. I think we should put this in quotes. He still had a higher overall approval than Cornyn.
That's okay. I'm glad you were waiting to say that. So as we... there's a couple things I would add to that, but I'm not going to. But as we, as we kind of then think about where we're going to go as we go forward on this, and this idea of, frankly, where Republican candidates, legislators, and then as candidates are standing as we go through one of these cycles in which the legislature leads into the statewide elections with the governor on the ballot, and as always, all the legislature. This has highlighted the big gambit that is happening right now in Texas politics, which is, the ascension of the post-Trump, Republican Party that looks a lot like the pre-Trump Republican Party, but with, some conditions changed, gambling on some pretty hard right turn plays, you kind of provided a list of some of them on guns, on abortion. It was even evident in, some of the attitudes about explaining this, the differences between Republicans and Democrats in their responses to the storm, and in particular, the other early scapegoat in this, which was renewable energy, and that resonated with elements of the Republican base. But, the environment is a treacherous one, and it's going to be interesting to see if going back to gambling on mobilizing the base in order to both inoculate incumbents against primary challenges where possible, and then gamble on the fact that Republicans are still going to have an electoral advantage in the general election, is one of the powerful subterranean storylines going on in the state right now. So on that, thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks to our ever-present and ever-excellent crew in the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. Thanks to you for listening. Also a nod to our colleagues on this poll at the UT Energy Institute, who were great to work with and came up with some terrific questions and ideas for doing this poll.
And I should just add, there's a ton of stuff in this poll that we're not talking about that's very interesting. And so if you want to look at all of these results, top lines, crosstabs, graphics, again, of pretty much all of the results in the poll, and really, there's an extensive battery of what people experienced during the winter blackout. You can find all that at texaspolitics.utexas.edu.
Yeah, tons of stuff. And also while you're there, check out the blog. There's a lot of we've been sort of parceling these out. So if you have thematic interest, that may help you too. Although we have great search tools all over the site for all this stuff. So thanks to everybody. Thanks to Josh for adding the plug at the end. And we'll talk to you next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.